Welcome to Artificiality. This is Dave Edwards. In this episode, I have a conversation with Will Griffin, the Chief Ethics Officer of Hypergiant, an Austin-based AI services company. I was interested in talking to Will because Hypergiant puts ethics right up front. You can find it prominently on their website. And you'll hear in a bit how Hypergiant introduces ethics at the beginning of each client engagement and includes it in multiple steps during the process. Perhaps most interestingly, though, is Hypergiant uses Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative as a core part of their ethics policy. Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative had two core parts. The first is, act always in such a way that your action could become a universal rule. And the second, always treat other people not as the means to an end, but as an end in themselves. Combining those two things in an AI project could have some interesting outcomes. The first formula states that whatever action your AI takes has to be able to be generalized so that every AI everywhere could take that same action. The second states that you can't use people as a means to an end, which means you can't use people simply as a means to profit. I find this is an interesting position in the AI industry when so many large companies are clearly using people as a means to the end. I had a great chat with Will, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. If you're enjoying our podcast, please remember to subscribe and give us a positive rating. Without further ado, here's Will Griffin. Well, Will, thanks for joining the podcast. It's good to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
I guess to start off, it would be helpful to get a bit of a description and background on Hypergiant.
So Hypergiant is an AI products and solution company working to solve humanity's biggest problems, and we're guided by our co-founder and CEO, Ben Lam's vision, which is delivering on the future we were promised. And the idea is to use AI technology in a way that pushes humanity forward. I think we focus pretty much on three main areas. One is critical infrastructure, the other is defense, and the other is space. We do work outside of those domains, but those are, the primary areas where our work is focused.
That's great. I like the premise of delivering on the future we were promised. What are some of the promises that you think are important that we should be delivering on that we're not delivering on yet?
I think, and this is kind of from Ben's overarching vision. I think if you know him and you kind of follow the work that he's done over the years. I think the idea was in previous companies, and he's been a very successful serial entrepreneur. It was about using tech to solve business problems, creating economic value. And then that led to the companies ultimately being acquired, by larger companies. I think the vision with this one is to build out Hypergiant Industries in a way that it can scale itself up to solve more of those problems. So one of the problems is space exploration. The other one is using technology in a way to combat climate change, as we've done with the EOS bioreactor. Some of the other problems are applying it to medicine, machine intelligence and neural networks. Others are in the areas of predictive maintenance, which make equipment in factories and machinery a lot safer, which is kind of some of the work we've been doing in oil and gas. I think those are some of the things that haven't been done. I think the idea is that tech has been so focused on the value creation part of it that it hasn't encompassed its overall ethical worldview to be used to solve problems. So it's not just solving business problems, but it's also solving some of the existential threats that face humanity.
So you're the company's chief ethics officer. What does that role mean at Hypergiant?
So that role at Hypergiant, Ben kind of had an overarching vision for what he wanted to do with the company. Through our vice president of hype and culture, I met Ben a few years ago, a couple companies ago for him and a couple companies ago for me. And he kind of talked about ultimately what he wanted to do, with his next venture. And so that venture that he had in mind was Hypergiant. So once he started, they got underway. We started talking again, and he said, well, what do you think about the area of ethics? Because obviously, over the last couple of years, it's obvious to everyone that tech companies have not really focused on ethics, and they've gotten themselves in trouble in the awareness of the lack of ethics in the tech community overall has become apparent. In order to fulfill his vision, he didn't want Hypergiant to fall in that trap, which is the classic move fast, break things, when the vision is to deliver on the future we were promised. So we kind of sketched out the role of ethics, and we started discussing, how I would approach it different from the way that it has conventionally been approached in tech. And so, I have a background as an entrepreneur, and I thought the idea of combining ethics is not a checklist as you'll normally see in the compliance departments at companies, where you wait for laws to be created and then you conform to those, but it's actually a set of habits that the company undertakes, and that it can be embedded in the workflows and embedded in the products we create. So I think the two differences between what you'll find at most companies who have ethics is one, we focus on each use case at a time. So the framework is applied specifically to use cases. So the process kind of works like this. When we get pitched or we go out for a pitch, we kind of do an ethical vetting of kind of what we're pitching, and then what the business problem that we want to solve, and then the way we want to solve it. Second part is within the statement of work. I review the statements of work through our ethical framework to make sure that they're consistent with it. And then the third part is once we begin on a project, then we embed our ethical framework into the workflows. So every division and every department that touches each specific statement of work or each project will go through an ethical vetting. And my goal is not to be like the compliance department at traditional companies and then wait for the work to start and then go back and go through and create a checklist to make sure everybody conforms. My goal is more educational, which is to run our head of design, our CTO, our strategy team, product managers, data scientists. Everyone becomes ingrained with the ethical framework, and so that they're able to implement it at all phases of the project on their own.
So that's interesting. So you bring the ethical process into those three different steps. So when you're walking into pitch a project, when you're defining the statement of work, and during the process of actually building out whatever the product or services is, for your client.
And so there's the internal educational process, so that all the people who are working on a specific use case or project are aware of the ethical framework and can implement it on their own. And then there's also the educational process of the client, which is when we lay out our design method, when we lay out our engineering method, and our strategy method, we can also say, and then here is our ethical framework, and here's how we're approaching the work.
How do you approach the client at the beginning? Walking in to pitch a project, going to build a new, application for you. And part of our process is going to be bringing an ethical framework to the relationship that we're building, right? So Hypergiant plus whoever your client is, you've got to walk in and actually, I assume, walk through some sort of educational process for them to think about what ethics might mean for an application that uses AI.
Correct. In the majority of times, our AI projects are enterprise-wide projects at scale. So we do have the benefit of dealing with C-suite executives in their already cross-functional teams because of the scale of the deployments or the solutions that we're designing. So usually when you're in that room, I think I was probably, 2 months in before I went into the first room, and there was the COO, the chief communications officer, general counsel, chief compliance officer, as well as the engineering teams and the CTO and the IT teams. So when you're in a cross-functional room, it's a lot easier to have this discussion because almost everybody in that room They read the trades. They're looking at their competitors. They see all the horror stories that are on the front pages of the newspapers, or it's just in the cultural zeitgeist of companies that are doing AI deployments. And obviously they want to avoid those things. So when we go in, we communicate two things. One is that we are aware of the potential impact of the technology, not just the business solution that we're offering, but also its potential impact on society. So fortunately, there's already a receptive audience when we go in. And then when we kind of lay out our approach, they begin to realize that it doesn't require you build an entirely new compliance infrastructure, or it doesn't require you to build out entire elements of your org chart that you probably don't have the skill set for. And in a lot of the industries, because we're in critical infrastructure defense space, they're already highly regulated. So they're already used to dealing with policies, checklists, and having those things embedded in their workflows. But what we try to do is we try to give them an approach consistent with the things that are unique to Hypergiant, which is that we're used to operating in an entrepreneurial environment where there are more unknowns than knowns, where the environment is changing quickly. And as Harvard Business School defines entrepreneurship, it's a horse race between fear and greed. So we're also aware of all the emotional considerations that come with AI deployments, especially at enterprise scale. So the educational process is on the business side, where we dispel some misconceptions that this will lead to people being laid off, because you can imagine a situation where you're working with people who are worried that either they or people within their reports or people within their org chart would be displaced by machines. So we dispel those, and then we also explain how our approach would actually increase and lead to more trust in the workplace. But more importantly, for the compliance and on the general counsel side, it will make the solutions more robust when it's inevitable that regulation in different parts of AI start to come on from different jurisdictional bodies.
When you mentioned that you work in industries, the critical infrastructure defense space, you work in industries that are used to being regulated, where they're used to there being rules of being right and wrong, determined by some sort of societal, political body, regulatory body. When you have worked with companies that are outside of those kinds of industries, do you find the conversation about ethics to be more challenging?
It just depends, but not really, because even though these companies are used to being in regulated industries, keep in mind, regulated industries are about laws and policies that are already written. The laws and policies are being written for AI, which makes a traditional big conglomerate, it essentially puts them into an entrepreneurial environment, which is where their habits today, the way they do business today, will determine the laws and policies that are ultimately written. So they're all in the same boat. From that perspective, they're all in the entrepreneurial environment. And that's the reason why when we go in there, our approach is a lot different from an Accenture. Our unique approach, because we are entrepreneurial, that is the ethos of the company. And we still are, the majority of people in here have been entrepreneurs, or they've worked in entrepreneurial environments. So we're very familiar about how to operate in an industry that will be regulated, but it's not regulated today. So people are very receptive because they know, because of their historical experience, that regulation is coming, and they're a lot more comfortable in a regulated environment, assuming the rules have been written in a way that allows them to be competitive. But where we come in is we say, we know regulation is coming, but we can shape the way that regulation is, not by a Google or Facebook approach or Microsoft or Amazon approach, where they actually write the legislation and they send it to Congress and you build big lobbying arms. But it can be done based on the ethical habits that you adopt today. And if those ethical habits become the industry standard, then the rules that are ultimately are written will be consistent with the way you already do business.
So we've been talking a lot about this framework, but we haven't gotten to what it actually is. So you've got a 3-step ethical reasoning process. Can you walk through those 3 steps?
The name of our framework is Top of Mind Ethics, or TOME. And the goal is to use a heuristic similar to back of the envelope calculations or the elevator pitch that most business people are very familiar with, which is a heuristic that allows you to analyze use cases quickly in a directional way that allows you to get a handle on the problems that you might grapple with. So our framework is based on Immanuel Kant. It's a deontological framework. Starts with step one, which is goodwill. Is the use case in and of itself, is there positive intent in the use case? And so that just allows us, when we look at the statement of work or when we look at the RFP or the work that's being contemplated, what is the goodwill element of what we're trying to accomplish? And that allows us to think creatively about what we're trying to do. So it's not just as narrow as the business problem that we're trying to solve, but it's a broader question, which is, we as a company, who are we? Is this use case consistent with our values, and does it have a positive intent? Then the second stage of the process is the categorical imperative, which is, if we deployed this use case in this way, and every company in our industry deployed use cases in this way, and if every industry in the world deployed use cases in this way, what would the world look like? And then the third stage is the law of humanity. Are people being used as a means to an end on this use case, or is the benefit primarily for people? So those are the three general areas. Now, in our companies, in the companies that we work with, and, pretty much almost every established company has a mission statement, a set of guiding principles. And then some companies who are, really self-aware have values propositions, a lot of time rooted in the worldview of its founders. And so we also vet it to make sure that the use case is consistent with those. So those are the three main buckets, but then there are 4 steps to the process. So the first step is the use case owner, which is usually either the C-suite executive or the general manager, who's responsible for shepherding the use case through their company. They have to make an affirmative case that the use case meets those 3 criteria, and the burden of proof is on them. Once they, essentially record, and this is all documented, once they record their affirmative case that their use case, meets the ethical framework, then a red team, which is generally composed of people at Hypergiant and people within our client companies who don't have a direct interest in the outcome of the use case, then the red team essentially goes through and they use their creative imaginations to raise objections to the claims that are being made by the use case owner. And then they also can bring in research or other arguments or other values that the use case may conflict with. Once that set of objections is raised, and that's across the 3 areas, they raise objections to the goodwill, they raise objections to the categorical imperative, and then they raise objections to the law of humanity. And if there are values conflicts with the missions of the organization, then they raise those. Those objections then go back to the use case owner, who then at that point is required to defend the use case as they proposed it, or make modifications to the use case in a way that it satisfies the objections. At that point, the entire file goes to an ethics review board. Now, the ethics review board, which is an independent adjudicator, the ethics review board varies by, organization. Sometimes the ethics review board really consists of a CEO or a CIO or a CDO. And then in some cases, and we think this is the best, in some cases, it's a cross-functional composition of C-suite executives who then make a determination based on the use case owner's affirmative case for the use case, and then the red team's rejections, and then they'll make an adjudication whether they accept, reject, or ask for modifications to the use case. That entire process is then kept in an archive. So any future use cases that are proposed, they can go in that library and they can see how the ethical reasoning was done on each use case. And it allows them to learn essentially how we do business around here.
Have you found any instances where the results of the process, or the inputs into the process, so the values of the company, come in conflict with Hypergiant as a service provider?
Conflict isn't, the word that I would use, because we can know early on if the use case is in conflict with the way that we do business. Fortunately, at this stage, we've had the luxury of either not bidding on or not continuing the process with companies who want to do things that are inconsistent with our values. But always an inherent conflict with a company that does not take ethics into account when they create their use cases or as they deploy their use cases. And in those, the reason why I don't consider them a direct conflict, because a lot of it is just an education process. They did not think about it, not because they're opposed to ethical vetting, but because that just hasn't been the way that they've done business. Usually we can explain how our ethical process, does two things. One is it makes sure that the things that you create are beneficial to society. But the second part is we actually make your solutions and your company more robust, because now we're going to operate in a way that's consistent with regulations that come down the pike.
Do you find any commonality in the things that people care about?
Yeah, I think the number one thing that people care about is they want to lead for C-suite executives, and they want to work for employees, companies that they're proud of. In the Silicon Valley culture, what had been rewarded is economic value creation, stock prices, exits. That was a metric by which people were proud. But when you deal in the industries that we deal in, and you deal with these larger enterprise companies, and then you'll see this even in more mature tech companies like a Microsoft, they want to work at companies and lead companies that they're proud of. And so they want to take advantage of and obviously deploy AI at scale, but they want to do it in a way that's consistent with their values. And then that's where we come in.
Is an interesting part of your process. It definitely captured my eye in your use of Kant's categorical imperative and the broader framework. There's two parts of that. One is act always in a way that your action could become a universal rule, and that's sort of your step two. There's also the second part, the second formula, that is always treat other people not as a means to an end, but as an end in and of themselves. And that's part of your law of humanity step. And I find that to be quite an intriguing part of a process for a company in the tech industry broadly, because we see so many technology companies that are actually using people as a means to an end. That's kind of their purpose. That's the way they make money, is using the people as the means to the end of making money. And so I find that you're stepping up and stating that really does put a hurdle for companies to get over, to think very carefully about how they use AI, technology that needs human data to be able to accomplish whatever goal it's going to try to accomplish. You have to be so thoughtful about how you're using people's data so that you're not using them as a means to an end.
Correct. And I like the way you formulated it, because there's either you learn how to deal with what is a perceived hurdle today, or you run into a straight roadblock tomorrow. It's inevitable. The public will demand policymakers enact regulation that puts a full stop to some technologies. So even though for the last 10 or 15 years, social media companies or tech companies have been able to get away with privacy abuses, that's coming to an end. And there was a point in time, probably could be a point in time all the way up until EU enacted GDPR, until the FTC fined Facebook $5 billion for its privacy violations. Now, some people would say, well, that's just the cost of doing business for Facebook. Yeah, that's true. But how many companies can spend $5 billion per regulatory prosecution? There are really only 10 or 15 companies who can survive that as a cost of doing business.
Yeah, but there's a much longer list of companies who could find themselves in that same sort of trouble.
And upside down. So I'll give you an example. Practice Fusion will forever be known as the first AI prosecution by the Department of Justice. So they provided AI solutions to small doctors' practices. They use machine intelligence and deep learning in order to make recommendations to doctors on what medications that they should prescribe to patients. Well, one of the recommendations that they actively pushed was the increase the prescription of opioids. What they didn't disclose to the doctors was that they were actually being paid by pharmaceutical companies to make these suggestions. Now, this was a company, the Silicon Valley based company, that had a lot of prominent VCs in it. Those VCs had a lot of prominent institutional investors in it. At one point, that company was worth $1.5 billion as late as the end of, in the middle of 2018. Once DOJ launched the investigation at the end of 2018, that valuation went down to $150 million. And then they ultimately were acquired by Allscripts, and then their valuation decreased. Now they're facing class action lawsuits. They wound up paying the $150 million DOJ fine, and their stock valuation decreased. And then they lost institutional investors who became aware of what they were doing in the acquisition that they made. So that's an example of a fairly good sized company that lost an enormous amount of economic value creation, and that DOJ investigation ended their ability to continue to function as an independent entity. So you'll see more cases like that than you'll see of the Facebooks and Googles who are able to pay fines across all of these policymaking jurisdictions. So what we try to say to companies is that these are things that top of mind ethics would have solved. Goodwill. We want to use electronic health records to make pharmaceutical prescription suggestions, including opioids. That would have failed at the goodwill stage. That is not a use case that any company that vetted using our framework would ever have deployed. There's no way if a use case owner had to make an affirmative ethical case for that use case, it would have ever made it through the first stage. The second stage would have been the red team, which are people who, sharp people within the company who would have raised those objections. There would have been no good answers to those objections. That's stage two. If you had an ethical review board who were more dialed into the fiduciary responsibilities of companies, then the ethics review board would have killed it. So that just tells you that that's a company that was operating outside of an ethical framework.
Sure. And in addition to those conflicts, they're clearly falling down on providing people autonomy and agency to act, right? So it sort of falls into your law of humanity step of using people simply as a means to an end. So as the AI manipulates the actions of the doctors to prescribe drugs that are more profitable, they're actually removing the human agency to act freely and make a choice.
Completely right. And they're taking advantage. So that's true for the patients, but it's also true for the doctors. You remove the doctor's autonomy and agency because there's an information asymmetry that Practice Fusion had, because they could aggregate the records of 5 million patients. So a lot of different practices. And so they use the trust that they developed with each independent practice group to say that we've seen the entire treatment continuum of these patients, and it's inevitable that they're going to need opioids. So you essentially take out the autonomy of the patients, and then you also use the information asymmetry you have as the aggregator to essentially dupe the doctors. And then what we're saying, and what we say to our clients when we kind of discuss these case studies, is we say our framework would have prevented this.
Do you find yourself to be more optimistic or pessimistic about the future of AI from an ethical perspective?
Well, I find myself to be more optimistic because keep in mind, we're operating in an entire discipline of computer science and engineering that is not well versed in ethics education. So in medicine, you can go all the way back to Descartes and the University of Paris in the 1200s, which was essentially the beginning of medical ethics. So they're 800 years in. there are still ethical lapses and abuses, but they have an ethics tradition in their discipline. In law, you can go back 400 years and there is an ethics education, and it's all the way into its licensing, requirements within that discipline. Within marketing, it can go back 100 years, or business, you can go back 100 years and you can see ethics being baked into their disciplines, from different disciplines, from accounting to now finance. But in computer science and engineering, there is not a genealogy of ethical training within their discipline. So the reason why I'm optimistic is because if we can assume goodwill on the part of human beings who operate as computer scientists and engineers, and that if they had the training and if they had a heuristic or a framework that was easy enough for them to use, that they would use it. And I feel like they have two reasons. One, on just a deontological level, that, the affinity of human beings to human beings. But I also feel like there's also a business reason, which is that in order to make your technological solutions more robust and survive regulatory scrutiny and receive the acceptance of the public, they're going to have to be ethical. So we're at, really the first inning of introducing ethics into that entire discipline. So I'm optimistic.
I want to thank you very much for joining the podcast. This has been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate the opportunity.
Stay